Hello. In this discussion, we're going to be examining some of my work that looks at regime type and transitions, neighbors, and private military and security company. This presentation is delivered in the context of a conference setting. So how we would deliver to our colleagues at a conference to get feedback and criticism. I like to start with motivation, identifying that states privatize security for a variety of reasons. But the majority of the research focuses on the US and the United Kingdom, which has obvious problems from a scientific standpoint. Empirical research on PMFCs focuses on conflict outcomes. So there's some military effectiveness on duration and severity. We also have some of the frequent pieces that we've discussed related to effectiveness and efficiency. I want to explore the factors that explain the variation in hiring practices. And we can see that in this map. I use a data set that looks at private security contracts in weak states. This particular map is African countries that experienced civil war during the time period 1990 to 2012. I think we'll check that. And what you see here are states that employed PMFCs are red. So there's clustering effect that you can see. Sahara-related countries typically do not hire within the continent. We see in this map, similarly, states that employed PMFCs are red. This is a different data set. This is data sets in weak states. So we have two different data sets that I use for the analysis, one that's only in Africa and one that looks at weak states. So the paper in brief asks the question, why do some states hire PMFCs and others do not? In this paper, I answer that it's regime type, transitions, and neighbor behavior. And then I examine this empirically to identify whether I'm right. So we think about the demand. Think about regime types, PMFCs, and presumed ubiquitous hiring. So there's this idea that all states at all times may hire firms, or if you're short on security, you may hire firms. But I don't think that's actually true. I think we have to think about the functional, political, and social control of force exerted by government. Deborah Avant's formative book in 2005 examines this, and she identifies that hiring practices and the function of force is determined by the functionality of the political and the social control, in that states with weak areas in one or the other behave differently than other states. She also identifies that there's differences for strong states and weak states. In this context, we think of a strong state as something like the United States that has extensive regulatory capacity and legal framework to administer and coherently coordinate PMFCs. Weak states may lack the enforcement capacity if they have the laws, or they may lack both laws and enforcement capacity. Think about the importance of political institutions in other ways. First, political institutions represent institutional bargaining and internal distributions of control. As depending on the regime type, whether it's democracy, a single-party regime, multi-party regime, a monarchy, a military junta, there are curtailing of options available to the leadership. When we think about how the decision-making process goes, whether you have to be in a single party, you have to pay your party dues and serve in different capacities as you rise in the ranks, that creates different incentive structures than you would expect in other contexts. In military regimes, in all regimes, the military remains a major threat. What we mean here is not necessarily in a democracy that you should be afraid of the military. That's not what we mean. What Barbara Gaddis means in this context is that for many regimes, domestic stability, is based on the security dynamic. And the military is the organization that provides that. This is obviously going to be particularly true in autocratic regimes where the military is a dominant force. So what are my expectations? I argue that when we think about one-party military regimes and multi-party or democracy regimes, that we can see different functions across three dimensions: legislature, power sharing, and information asymmetries. In one-party systems ensure that there's bargaining, which actually curtails options. What do we mean by that is no policy option will be considered by the party that hasn't been vetted and gone through an internal bargaining process, which means certain things are going to be cut out, which also means that PMFCs and the internal power distribution means that if the party hires the firm, it's like the firm will be beholden to the party. It's not going to be beholden to certain subsections of the organization. Finally, it reduces asymmetries between the government and, in this case, PMFCs by the third party, because there's only one organization. So it doesn't matter if you're talking to the executive or the legislative branch of a single party system, it's the same government, right? It's not the same in other contexts. We think about military regimes, there's no legislature. The PMFC, the autocrat would undermines elites. So if you hire PMFCs to be your security force, you are actually challenging or threatening the military, which is how you stay in power. Well, the information asymmetry means that in this context, the military wants to preserve the status quo. That would reduce the likelihood that a military regime would want to hire a PMFC. Finally, we think about democracies. Obviously, there's enables bargaining just like a one-party regime, but it would actually, some would argue, undermine legitimacy when democracies hire PMFCs. Finally, when we think about power sharing, and this is the key distinction between one party and multi-party, you will have opposition groups. And opposition groups, in terms of hiring or beholding to a PMFC of some form, means that you are less likely to see them being hired in weak states. So all of this argument is predicated on being in a weak state. This, for example, would not apply to the United States. Weak states, therefore, I would argue, that are one-party regimes are more likely to employ PMFCs than other types. What about regime transitions? Okay, so remember what a transition is here is when the underlying political or social order changes. Autocratic regimes retain power. Retention of power is the top priority. For a autocratic regime in this context, perceived military effectiveness may reduce constraints and improve your ability to hold power. So in this context, we would argue that PMFCs can actually be beneficial to those, regardless of regime type, but going through a regime transition, because they bring additional military capability. Remember, so if you are thinking in this context, it is about improved capacity. So states experiencing regime change are more likely to employ PMFCs than stable regimes. And then finally, we think about military. Theoretically, I argue that PMFCs as military interventions. This is a spillover effect. Arguably, adoption of military innovations is conditioned by organizational capacity and financial intensity. That's Horowitz's book. So you have to have the organizational capacity over the control of force if you're going to hire PMFCs, let alone the funding. And so arguably, there's going to be a spillover effect. And states with neighbors that employ PMFCs are therefore more likely to employ them. And then states that employ them when there's conflict are more likely to do it. So we think of this as a stair step. If your neighbor does it, you can see it, you can start to learn, figure out how to do it, you're more likely to do it. If you're in conflict and your neighbor hires a firm, you will be much more likely to hire a firm. The research design, I use two different samples to examine this. One is the armed conflicts dataset. The other is the private security database. And so they have comparable time periods, but different geographies and different coding processes. The dependent variable is PSC employed. So in this case, when I think about your article reviews, this is what I mean. So there's the dependent variable. It's coded 1 or 0. There's the sources. Regime types. I get this from the Autocracies of the World data set, and then I code one-party, military party, multi-party, and democracy. I code transition, and then I code neighbor. Those are my key explanatory variables, and obviously I have 3 key hypotheses, or 4, but 3 main theoretical arguments, 3 key variables. I do a bunch of controls, and then because we live in the era we do where computation is easy, I do an extensive number of estimation. All right, so what were the results? How to interpret this chart? So instead of presenting just a table with stars, what this table shows you is the four different models, because I have two different data sets, and I want to show what happens with all of those data sets and the variables. How to interpret this is moving from on this axis is the coefficient. So that's what you would see in the table. These bars that you see here, that I'm identifying with the cursor, are the confidence interval. Where the bar does not go over 0, it's statistically significant. If the bar goes over 0, it's not a statistically significant result. So let's interpret this starting at the bottom. If we think about transition, what this shows in weak state transitions, the likelihood of that transition increases the likelihood of employing PMFCs, as both results, depending on, it doesn't matter which data set you use, whether it's Civil War data set or the weak state data set, is significant. If we compare party results, that is also the same for one-party system. So that supports hypothesis 1, transition supports hypothesis 2. In all contexts, single-party system increases the likelihood of employing PMFCs. What we see, though, is that military party crosses that line. All the lines cross that line, which means they are not statistically significant. And you may ask, why? Where's democracy? Democracy is not included in this because it's the reference category. These are the results for the neighbor effect. And as you can see, the neighbor and the PMFC neighbor conflict both are statistically significant and positive, which mean on this side means it's a positive coefficient, means they're more likely to increase it. What's the substantive effect? Well, for Model 2 and Model 7, if you are a one-party government, you're about 35% more likely to employ a PMFC in any given year. Regime transition is about 38%, and then the neighbor conflict variable is also about 30. But what is interesting here is that dynamic identified, that it's not just having a neighbor. If you have a neighbor that's in conflict, it increases it substantially more, moving it from about a 16% change to about a 30% change in the likelihood. I do a ton of robustness checks. These are just there really for discussion in case someone has a question. And so what are the conclusions? I would argue that PMFC employment is conditional on regime change. Regime transitions increases the likelihood of PMFC employment, and the results suggest that PMFC adoption is multifaceted. Okay, now if you will notice, there's a ton of other slides in this presentation, but this is where the presentation ends. When I give a professional presentation, we don't provide all the information up front. The remaining slides are there just to answer questions. So thank you for taking time to watch this video. I hope you enjoyed it.